Hey everybody, we are Francis, Martin, and Robert, and this is Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Get ready, we're about to live in your head rent-free.
Welcome back to Snakes and Otters.
I am Martin.
And I'm Robert.
And I'm Francis. In the captain's chair this time. This is episode 56. We've got another Heroes for you, and we've got a great one. And before I spoil it, let me give you a quotation from him. I'm 30 years older than you are, had my back broke once and my hip twice, and on my worst day, I could beat the hell out of you. Yep, that's the Duke. That's John Wayne. That's from the amazing movie later in his career, The Cowboys, the movie that turned Bruce Dern, who he was speaking to there, into the most hated man in America at the time, because it's one of those movies. Hey, if you haven't seen his movies, I'm going to spoil a few. Yeah, there are a few that he dies in. That was one of them.
Very few.
But boy, what an amazing story. It's still one of the best coming-of-age stories ever done. And the reason we like to talk about John Wayne is he was formative for us in the early years. Dies in 1979 of cancer after an enormous career. We really love those people who work their craft well, and he certainly did that. Everybody watched all of his movies. He just showed up, and they went. And there's something to that. And the characters he played, and the optimism he brought, and the heroism he brought, even though he himself was a flawed individual, that's worth exploring. And one of the sad things about John Wayne is, for those of us, our age, mid-50s and older, he's a whole lot of stuff. But you get much younger than 40, and he's just a name. Most of those people haven't even seen most of his movies. And that is a tragedy, because he made some great ones. And we're going to talk about those today. Guys, what are your thoughts?
Would you like to do a little bio real quick? We always try to throw out a little tiny bit of bio, not too in-depth.
Well, just to kind of give you what we're talking about here on his background here, he's old Hollywood. He comes up in the 20s. He changes his name. He's born Marion Michael Morrison, which kind of doesn't sing on the screen. So he ends up changing it to John Wayne. He's associated with John Ford early on, the director,
yes,
who started his career in the 20s. Wayne was somebody that kind of fell into what he was doing. His first movie's in 1926, mind you, and he worked through the studio system in the B westerns that are being made all over the place. They're cheap, they're easy. He even plays a singing cowboy at one time, singing Sandy. Believe it or not, you can still see him in some of those. They're not bad. And he eventually, because of his square jaw and his voice, that deep baritone that he's got, he's noticed. And Howard Hawks puts him in a movie called Stagecoach. Let me back up. In 1930, he does a movie that's known as The Big Trail. It's his first starring role, and it gets him noticed. And eventually, in 1939, which was a big year for movies, by the way, because Stagecoach comes out, Gone with the Wind comes out, Wizard of Oz comes out, all those years. I think The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn come out that year. Don't quote me on that one. I'm close. It's close to that, though. And it made him a star, a cowboy star, and until 1977, he makes 142 movies. 142 movies. And almost every single one of them is a hit. Now, it takes a little while for him to get known that he's a bankable star. But he's doing amazing movies during the war. He stays making movies during the war, but he's making war movies. He is one of the early stars who is known for being somebody that we need you here, because you're bringing more boys into the Army and the armed forces just by being who you are. There's some really great war movies he does, westerns. He's got a career that's amazing. We're going to talk about some of his, our favorite movies of his, and we all have them. He wins an Oscar in 1969 for True Grit, the only one he ever won. Well deserved. He's been accused of playing himself a lot. That may be true, but I don't see that as being a sin, because if everybody likes to see you play yourself and pays money to see you play yourself, what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
Jack Nicholson has made a career out of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was never a method actor. He took whatever part he had and he made it a John Wayne part.
That's exactly right, and because he could do what he wants eventually. I mean, he turned down some really big movies too. I mean, he was supposed to be Lee Marvin's role in The Dirty Dozen, but he turned it down. He went and made the movie that he wanted to make, The Green Berets, a pro-Vietnam movie in 1967. That was a huge risk. The movie made money, but it was definitely he's put a stake in the ground saying where he was politically at a time where that's not something that most people were doing, because Wayne was somebody that believed what he believed. He was also very much known to be kind to other actors. He believed the craft was something that crossed lots of divides, and he saw it as something that really brought people together. He was definitely somebody who picked the right vocation in life. He was very good with that. Thoughts?
Well, yeah, you're wow.
I mean, good Lord. You know, the thing about John Wayne that, you know, when I think of him, one of the things I think of is being a kid in the 70s and, you know, always being excited when I saw one of the handful of movies that was constantly making the Saturday night movie reruns. You know, like True Grit or McClintock. You know, there were by no means were all of his movies making those rounds, but you know, there were a handful of those westerns, mostly the latter ones, that would constantly be rerun on television. And you still loved seeing those, and you know, it was like being excited when the Planet of the Apes movies made their rounds, you know, and certain other kinds of things like that. So that's one of the first memories I have of really being a John Wayne fan is some of those latter movies that were just seen on television.
Yeah, once he started doing color, that's what you would see, because they're not going to show the old black and whites except locally. Now, you could see those on Saturday afternoons and things like that. Of course, they eventually resurface on Turner Classic Movies and other cable channels in the 80s after Wayne is dead. And they gained a little bit of a life there. But Wayne was a powerful force in Hollywood. I mean, he could, but just by signing on to something, he could make the movie happen. And he did that more than a few times.
Pardon me.
He's somebody that was just, he was known as a patriot. That's one of those things that I find so admirable about him. He was given the Congressional Gold Medal. They actually created one for him, John Wayne American. His co-star and good friend Maureen O'Hara, along with Elizabeth Taylor, believe it or not, Frank Sinatra, Katharine Hepburn, and many others, testified to Congress in support of the award. Kirk Douglas, people that knew him. That's unheard of, because these are people from all over the political spectrum to come together and say, this guy here had something that we think is deserving of something special after the fact. It was amazing to be, because that's something we don't do today. We would never do that today. Mm-hmm. It's just not going to happen, and that's one of the reasons that we really like him. He was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously by Jimmy Carter in 1980.
Year after he died.
Yeah, exactly. He is just somebody, I think, that it pains me to think that we are not watching his movies anymore, and a younger generation doesn't see him anymore. And I'm trying to figure out why that is.
Well, part of it, I think, is, you know, we forget because he was a big star up until the end. Now, granted, he didn't make movies at the rate he did in the last 15 years of his life as he did the first 30 of his movie life. Because, you know, he was active from 1930 until 1976. That's 46 years making movies. And so we have to remember that the bulk of that time, his movies are black and white.
Right.
And that right there has a lot to do with it. You know, we've talked about it before. You know, my son is not a black and white movie kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, now he's learned to love them. Some of the ones that I've had him watch, you know, but for the most part, nobody really is going to seek those out. That's why they're all on Turner Classic Movies. You know,
Right.
that's why TCM has almost all of the black and whites.
Yeah.
You know, it's a specialized group of viewers, and you know, unfortunately, it's the kind of thing that will not. Yeah, I fear that those movies, after our generation is gone, will almost never be seen again, unless you're a film.
Right. Yeah, unless you're a film buff. And this is a shame because you have to understand that his cultural mystique as an American icon spread beyond our shores. When Emperor Hirohito came to the United States in 1975, he wanted to meet John Wayne because he saw him as the symbolic representation of his country's former enemy. When Nikita Khrushchev comes in 1959, he wanted to go to Disneyland and meet John Wayne. I mean, think about that. This is unheard of.
You think it's more American than Disneyland and John Wayne.
That's exactly right. And that's an amazing thing here. The movie Sands of Iwo Jima, which is one of, and I'm sorry if you haven't seen these movies, but shame on you if you haven't. I'll spoil it anyway. It's one of the movies that he dies in. Again, like I say, there's only a handful. But he does so heroically on Iwo Jima. It was made shortly after what happened because they recreate the flag raising there. And that movie was a touchstone for American people who, of course, heard the story but didn't quite understand it until Wayne portrays this on the island at the time. It's a moving moment.
He gets a bad rap for playing that same character over and over. And there's a lot to that because he had a distinctive way of speaking, and you know he wasn't one of those guys like Charlton Heston that you know used voice coaches to try and effect different accents. Although to be honest, I don't know that Chuck was ever all that successful with it. I never really heard a whole lot of different accents coming out of him.
He still sounds like Chuck. Nothing.
He still sounds
not
like
a bad
Chuck
thing. Yeah.
But he tried. God love him. He tried. But you know that was his dedication to his craft. But when you look at certain movies, you realize what a great actor he was. He could really act. You know, to me, one of the best scenes I've ever seen John Wayne do was the scene in The Longest Day when he comes upon the city of was the town of Claremont. Claremont.
That's right. Yeah.
And the paratroopers are gunned down as they're coming down, and they get caught up in the trees, and they're just hanging there as the American infantry arrives. And the emotion that he displays, when it hurts him to see those American men hanging from those branches, dead. To me, it was a fantastic scene. He was really good in that. So you know he can act. You know he wasn't just a one-note guy.
Absolutely, and especially as he got older, I think he seasoned well. Some of his, and this is part of the time we were born and the time we grew up, those later movies of his have their own unique charm. I still think his final movie, The Shootist, is one of his very, very best. It's done very, very differently. It is the swan song of the aging gunfighter who goes out in a blaze of glory while he's dying of cancer. Well, that's prophetic because Wayne himself was dying of cancer at that time and would die that very next year.
No. 3 years later.
Okay. All right.
76, I think, is the last movie.
That's right.
Yes, the Shootist was made in 76, and he dies in 79. So,
right.
But yeah, it is his final film. He was too ill to do any more, and he never did little bit parts or anything at the end of his career. He was always the star.
Right, exactly. He never went. He was actually offered to play the Waco Kid by Mel Brooks, Gene Wilder's role in Blazing Saddles. He said he thought it was too. The reason he turned it down is because he read the script and said the dialogue was too dirty for his family image. But he said he'd be the first person in line to see the movie. So.
Well, and I don't think that movie would have worked with John Wayne.
No, it wouldn't. You couldn't. It would have changed his image, and he was very conscious of that.
It would have changed the movie. I don't think the movie itself would have worked.
Yeah, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, exactly.
He's not believable in that part.
Yeah, you know, one of the things about John Wayne, we kind of have danced around this. To put it in modern terms, John Wayne is the first that every man in this country had a man crush on. You know, I mean, that's the way you got to put it. because there wasn't a guy around that didn't either want to be him or hang out with him.
Well, you're exactly right on that. That's correct. He was the hero for actually multiple generations because of his long career. Those who were children during the war, he was their hero, and their children, which is us, were also looked to him as their hero. And that's an amazing thing. There isn't anybody like that anymore. There's no movie actor that you can look up to and say, that's who I want to be. An icon. And there might be some exceptions to that, I suppose, but I can't see anybody saying that about Tom Cruise or whoever else. They might want their money, they might want to be an actor, but to be the person, be this image.
Well, that's the thing.
Model
movie stars are going to do movies, though, that are a lot more varied in type and depth than what John Wayne did. And it's not to say that John Wayne definitely was a one-note act, because he wasn't. He just did a lot of similar roles because he had a particular image that certain roles are going to be offered to him. Nowadays, actors are going to want to play not just the hero but the anti-hero. Sure. There was no such thing as an anti-hero. We called them the villain.
Right.
When John Wayne was making movies.
Yeah. You're exactly right. Although, I will give you this, he actually lobbied hard to play Dirty Harry in 1971, that's definitely an anti-hero role. But he was 63 at the time, and it was felt that it was too old, which there's probably something to that. Although, I think Wayne could have pulled it off. It would have been a very different movie. Very different movie. Because he does Brannigan and McHugh, those two cop shows around that time, which were... Hey, they made money because John Wayne was in them, but they weren't all that great. If you had a great script like Dirty Harry, however, who knows?
Maybe. It's hard to maybe those movies didn't do as well because it's hard to see him either not wearing a uniform, military uniform, or set in the 1800s as a cowboy.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
He did a few others, not many. And I'll give you a great example of the only stinker in his words that he ever did.
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan. That's right, the Conqueror. He played Genghis Khan, and it's considered to be something of a Hollywood scandal. And it proved that Wayne couldn't do just anything he wanted. He couldn't do anything. He had to do what he was good at. But he played that one. Another one that he did, Legend of the Lost, with Sophia Loren, which was a bit of a stinker. If you've ever watched it, it's pretty stinky. There are a few of those duds out there. Not many. Most of his movies were always very successful. But he would play around.
There were some non-Western movies that he did. He did pretty well with. I can't remember the name of it. You'll remember it, Francis. He plays a firefighter. Oil well.
Yes, Hellfighters. Yes. Yeah, that was a late movie. That was color, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Oh, yeah. That's a '60s film. I think. I think that even has one of his sons in it. It's so late.
Yeah, and then they get older. Yeah.
What is the other one? Hatari.
Hatari. That's the one that has Lee Marvin in it, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wrong. No, I'm sorry.
I can't remember for sure, but that's like it's set in Africa. He collects animals.
That is correct. Hatari. That was a very different one. No, that's Howard Hawks did that movie. It's the one that it was in East Africa and all that. Like you say, it's a very the TV series Daktari was based on that after the fact because it was a moderately successful thing, but it's basically Jungle Jim meets John Wayne, which was Jungle Jim was the successor to the Tarzan movies. Johnny Weissmuller does all these in the 30s and 40s, does these Tarzan movies, and he gets too old to play him, so they bring in a new Tarzan, but they retire him and make Jungle Jim movies, where he doesn't have to wear the loincloth, and he can actually go around and do some stuff. These were moderately successful in the 50s, so this is kind of like, let's do some of that. He's got, there's some weird, Donovan's Wreath, I'm sorry, is the one with Lee Marvin in it. It's actually a bit of a comedy. Not a bad movie in the 60s. Some of these are hit and miss, but I'd love for us to talk about some of his great roles, because I think if he's going to be a hero of ours, when he does the craft well, and I'm just going to throw out some of these to you here because you know most of these, the really, really good ones. I'm going to throw out the first one, the movie that Steven Spielberg said is the greatest movie ever made. Greatest movie ever made. Steven Spielberg says this. John Wayne, The Searchers.
The Searchers. Probably his most complex role because he has to move from someone who consumed by hate and revenge to someone who can forgive.
That's right. Well,
Very,
to offer
very
mercy.
complex role.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, because he doesn't really forgive. It's more nuanced than that. But he's willing to not kill to do that. And that's one of the. And of course, it's hugely. Jeffrey Hunter is in this. The two of them together make a really great pair. And it's the loneliness. Now, it's a John Ford movie, so you know it's directed well. It's one that really, it's 1956. It's an amazingly nuanced, almost the pathos. There's your word, Martin. Is all over the place with this one here, and that's one of the reasons I think there's a sadness in that movie. It's not fatalistic because it does have a happy ending. Now I'll give you my favorite of his movies, which is a fatalistic movie, and of his with some really great. With some really great co-stars in that, and that's Fort Apache in 1948, black and white with Henry Fonda. If you held me down and made me tell you what is your favorite John Wayne movie of all, and made me pick only one, it would probably have to be Fort Apache. I've seen it hundreds of times. It never fails to entertain. It's too long by modern standards. It's not a lot of action goes on in certain places. Of course, that's how they made those movies in '48. But especially when you get to the climax, all this pays off with the martinet of Colonel Thursday, played by Henry Fonda, basically gets his command slaughtered. And the only person that knows this is wrong is his second in command that says you can't do this. You know, he even throws down his gauntlet against him to try to get him to stop, and he won't. You know, and of course he's one of the few survivors. And in the end, everything has changed, and he's learned from the martinet, and is similar to him, but he never loses that which, you know, he doesn't pick up the fatal flaws. And it's just a complex story on that. And I love it. It's one of those that I cannot watch enough. It's part of the John Ford's Cavalry trilogy. It's the first one of those. The other two were Rio Grande and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, which was actually in color. That one usually gets the most accolades because he plays a different character in that one. But these are John Wayne. These are amazing moments. And if you want to see him push back against that criticism that he could only play one character or one role, watch some of these. They really do a fantastic job with that. Some movies we know very well. The Alamo, he directed it. He plays Davy Crockett, for goodness sakes. He got a Best Director nomination from that. And I think we deserve to toast the man, for goodness sakes.
Yeah, let's take a pause.
What are we drinking, boys?
I got a tiny bit of my larceny here.
So I decided that in honor of recording this about John Wayne and we're going to do a bit about the Westerns, I decided to go with something that would be something distinctly at home in a Western, and that is the Devil's Cut.
There you go.
A little bit harsher than we normally go for, probably it would make when you're not in the mood for something really harsh, it would make a better mixing bourbon. But nothing wrong with something a little bit harsh, straight up either. So.
Well, I've actually pulled out a few stops on this one, and I've opened up a new bottle, boys. I've opened up a bottle of Knob Creek this time. We've not used that before. It is, I believe it's called a super premium, if I'm not mistaken. It's one of the very best. We've not featured it on here before, and I thought John Wayne deserves something cool, so I've decided to have a little bit of that. Neat. Over time I have discovered, yes, there's a snobbery to that, which I always pushed back on before, but I'm kind of on that side now. Yeah, let the bourbon be the bourbon, boys. Just drink that. It doesn't have to be chilled. Just take it as it is. Take a little bit.
I prefer mine chilled. Ideally,
I'm getting over it.
Ideally, I would have the metal steel cubes, or using my former pastor. Whenever we would have bourbon over there in the cigar lounge, he had a 2-inch diameter steel ball, which is great because it would roll around very nicely in the cup.
Gives you a good clink. Yeah.
Get you a good clink, but it wouldn't melt to dilute the bourbon. Although some bourbon, it's such a high alcohol content, you really should use ice to let it dilute just a little bit. Some say the ice and letting it melt brings out the best flavor in the bourbon. So it depends on your preference there. But I tend to not like bourbons where I have to mix it to make it palatable anyways.
That.
Not anymore.
That's right.
Not anymore.
We have grown, gentlemen. We have come into our own. We've learned as we should. That's kind of the journey, isn't it? To always find our way to getting better and better.
Well, to be fair, if you're not a whiskey drinker of any kind or any hard alcohol drinker of any kind, it's hard to just go straight into a good bourbon or a good whiskey. I imagine a good Scotch as well, without getting acclimated to it in some way. So I always tell people, if you're not going to drink straight up, then you got to start with the lower shelf bourbons, and it's okay to mix with those. And then as you move on to the better bourbons, you can stop mixing.
Amen to that.
What did John Wayne drink? Do we know?
Actually, I
whatever
don't.
He wanted.
Well, okay, I'm going to have to go with you on that one. You're right. I do not know that. Whatever he wanted.
Whatever he wanted.
Yeah.
Whatever he wanted.
I
He was
feel
John Wayne, damn it.
Yeah. I'm sure. I feel confident it was either whiskey or bourbon. I don't know that though. So
let's see if Google knows the answer.
Yeah, please go right ahead. I'd love to talk some more about something because you guys have not told me your favorites.
Oh well, let me tell a story real quick first, and then I'll talk about some of my favorite John Wayne movies. This is a story that Ronald Reagan told in the 1970s, right after Wayne's death, on his radio addresses. So this was after being governor of California, but before his presidency. He did those radio addresses in the 70s. And even before he was governor, Reagan was president of the Screen Actors Guild, and it was a very rough time. He had a hard time with it. And he said that he was headed to some meetings that were going to be very contentious, and Nancy was going to stay home, but she got a phone call. And at this time, they did not know Wayne all that well, but it was the Duke on the phone, offering to take Nancy to the meetings and sit with her, just so she'd have some company and somebody reassuring to be with her.
Right, because who's going to mess with John Wayne?
Yeah, and
that's right.
Nobody asked him to do that. He just did. He reached out to somebody he was just kind of an acquaintance of, but felt like they could go to these meetings and it be civilized, and go to these and go to things and not drag people's families through the mud and stuff like that. That's who he was. If you got a problem with me, you bring it to me. You don't go after families and things like that. He had that code. That was part of his code. I'm not gonna give you a hard time. You don't give me a hard time. So
there's actually a quote from one of his movies about that. He said, so much of him became the role, and so much of the roles was drawn from him. And that's just a fascinating thing. You just don't get that anymore. Yeah. There's nobody that can pull that off.
Well, I think for some actors, though, I think that becomes true. I think if you look at a Tom Cruise movie, if you look at a George Clooney movie, I think you'll see something similar happening there. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that that what comes out there is as great as what comes out with John Wayne, but then I would rather hang out with John Wayne or be like him than either one of those two.
I would agree completely. Yes, he's somebody that you definitely love to sit and have a beer with, or bourbon.
So speaking of the alcohol, I did look it up, and of course Google knew, because Google knows everything.
That's right.
And he had two favorites. He liked tequila, which, given his preference for wives, that's not too surprising.
Yeah, all his wives were Hispanic, if I recall correctly.
Yes. But also, he preferred bourbon over generic whiskey.
I knew there was a reason we liked him.
So, right there, that's it. That's my favorite fact about John Wayne. He was a bourbon man.
Yeah. He did drink quite a bit, though.
Yeah. Well, and he smoked quite a bit. He was a 6-pack a day smoker. Now, I have a hard time just imagining that, because my mom and dad, my brother, my sister, they were all smokers. I'm the only one that was not. My mom and my dad, they were both about a 3-pack a day. I can't imagine being able to smoke twice what they did. Yet he did.
Yeah. And he got the habit back when that's what you did. Everybody smoked back in 30s and 40s. That's especially once he could afford it. And he just eventually it killed him, because he did die of lung cancer.
Well, he had lung cancer. He had stomach cancer.
Right.
There are some who say that he got the cancer. He credits the lung cancer from the 6-pack a day habit. But he filmed a movie on or in Nevada near where they were doing nuclear testing. There were like a half dozen people involved in the production of that movie that later got cancer. And
that's the Conqueror. That's the Genghis Khan part.
Yes, that's the one.
Genghis Khan filmed in Utah, and I think the Wikipedia Wikipedia article says something about 91 people involved in the production eventually had cancer, including Susan
the half
Hayward.
dozen I was thinking of were the more famous people.
Yeah, the big stars. So, but he never felt it was that. He felt it was the smoking.
Yeah. Now the stomach cancer maybe, but if you're smoking 6 packs a day, you're not doing the stomach cancer any favors either.
Yeah. So
my favorite, I'd say, I don't know if I have one particular favorite, but I have a few that I just love.
You can't reduce the man down to one, really.
There's
several.
I absolutely love True Grit and McClintock. Love those. Those are a little bit later. Love him in The Longest Day. I just am just so enamored of his portrayal of that lieutenant colonel.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was an ensemble cast too, so he didn't have. It's not like he had a lead. I mean, he sort of did, because he's probably one of the biggest names in that movie. But there's a lot of names in that movie, and it was.
Yes, they're big now. Yeah. But yeah, that movie had a lot of people who became extremely famous, but he wasn't the lead. You can't really do one person as the lead in a movie like that.
Yeah.
But just about anything he did, I would want to watch.
Yeah.
Well, you're exactly right. That was one of his charms, is because all you needed to hear is it's a John Wayne movie, and it's
So Martin, what's yours?
Oh yeah, that was. You guys probably know my favorite, because I've mentioned this many times. El Dorado.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is one of my favorites, because Ed Asner gets shot in the end, and of course The Shootist. We've talked about The Shootist already, where he plays J.B. Brooks, Ron Howard, and Harry Morgan, Strother. Not Strother
Martin.
Yes. No, he's not in it. He's in True Grit. And why can I not think of the female lead, guys? Bogart's woman, Lauren Bacall. Lauren Bacall and Ron Howard. The Shootist is really, really good. And again, another one of those great performances, a lot of depth. Jimmy Stewart's even in it briefly.
Yes.
Richard Boone as well. He's one of the villains, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Big Jake is a good one. Chisholm.
Fantastic movie. Big Jake.
Oh, yeah, Chisholm,
Yeah, Chisholm, a recounting, kind of a, fictionalized, but somewhat of a recounting of the Lincoln County War in New Mexico. Pat Garrett, Billy the Kid stuff all figures into it. It's pretty good. There's a ton of those 60s westerns that are really good that he's in.
The Man Who Shot
his
Liberty
films.
Valance, boys, might be one of his. He considered that one of his greatest roles, and it is. It's a fantastic role for both him and Jimmy Stewart, who played together several times, and that might be one of his finest. He has many finest because he's playing a little bit against type. He's playing the tough guy, but he's also a tragic figure here in this movie because he's the one that does the deed and has to stay quiet about it so Jimmy Stewart can get his girl. It doesn't come across, the way it's supposed to. Which is
I forgot to mention. I forgot to mention Rooster Cogburn. Love that movie.
Oh, that's a fun movie.
Sequel he ever did.
Yes, love it because it is so much fun.
Well, he and Katharine Hepburn, put the two of them together, and you got lightning in a bottle. I mean, it's just an amazing the ability. And True Grit, to be honest, annoyed me a little bit because I thought Kim Darby's character was absolutely annoying. I'm sorry, I know she was intended to be, and I get it. Point.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, Glenn Campbell does a fantastic job. He's a singer, for goodness sakes, but he does a great job in that movie. It's a fine movie. But you can say that about almost all of his movies. I mean, we can talk about some of the stinkers, and we have talked about a few of them. There were others. Usually when he tried to go against his strengths. When he was playing things that he was very comfortable playing, they were really great. But, there were different ones that he would do from time to time that really, were interesting.
I think one of the things that if you really look at who he was in a movie with over his years, that right there speaks to how well thought of he was as a man, as an actor, because he wasn't in so many movies that are made today, you can only afford one big star.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else is either mid-level actors or relative unknowns, or they're character actors that, they're in a lot of stuff, but they don't make the huge bucks. He was in movies with lots of big names. They wanted to work together. To me, that says a lot about him, that he could draw that kind of talent into his movies and be okay with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Maureen O'Hara is probably his greatest co-star, and in fact, she's the one that lobbied for the medal for him after his death. And she was in at least a half a dozen. I can't name all of them because she was in so many. They were fantastic together and knew it. And
one of my wife's favorite movies is a John Wayne movie.
The Quiet Man, perhaps?
Yes.
I thought so. That's another one that's kind of against type. You see, the whole premise that John Wayne could only play John Wayne is not right because all you have to do is point to a few, like The Quiet Man, where he's playing something very different. He's still John Wayne because
I'm kind of fond of that one. I'm kind of fond of that one too because Maureen O'Hara in her heyday was a babe.
Oh, no question. She's
a
beautiful woman. That's correct. And she was also an amazing actress because you can see she played the fiery redhead with amazing elan, particularly in that movie, because it was kind of like it was almost like Taming of the Shrew in some ways, but it was not near as harsh as it was. It actually was a great love story. It was the intention, and it was based on a short story, but it's a fantastic movie. It really is. Here we go again. We use those words, fantastic movie with John Wayne. You almost can't not do that.
So I want to, I know you're captaining this. So if we decide we don't want to touch on this, we can certainly leave listeners to do their own research. But I feel like we probably should bring up some of his controversial views that came out in that Playboy interview from 1971, because that's the reason why he is not well thought of anymore. And I had the quote up, and I don't mind reading because it doesn't take away from how good he was at his craft.
Right.
And certainly, anybody today would be embarrassed to say the things that were said in that. But just a little bit of it here. When he was talking about race relations, he was talking about how he didn't want to, as he put it here, we can't all of a sudden get down on our knees and turn everything over to the leadership of the blacks. I believe in white supremacy until blacks are educated to a point of responsibility. I don't believe in giving authority and positions leadership to people, leadership and judgment to irresponsible people. And then he talks about the Indians. I don't feel we did wrong in taking this great country away from the Indians. Our so-called stealing of this country from them was just a matter of survival. Now, there's one thing that to me jumps out in this, and that is that it is a statement of its time. Because I can't tell you how many times I heard my own parents say similar things.
Sure, he was of that generation, yes, that they hadn't learned what we ourselves have learned about that. In fact, John Wayne's son Ethan defended him, saying, that you really shouldn't judge him on that interview because that's not who he was. But it's very easy to vilify him because of that, because that's so unpalatable to us today, completely.
Right. Well, and it was unpalatable 40 years ago in 1971.
Mm-hmm.
That was a controversial thing that he said even back then. And I certainly do not want to excuse it because
no, you can't.
It's not something you can excuse, but I can also recognize it for what it is, and that is probably what the vast majority of Americans still thought at that time. It was
reflective of a racism that was so pernicious in society at that time. Certain people just couldn't get out of it.
Well, it is, but I think there's also, you see movement. And this is where he's not going to get any credit for it. Maybe he shouldn't because it's not enough. I don't know. But I think there is a recognition, though, that not all of what we would call African Americans today, they said blacks back then, are the same. And there was a recognition that there was progress still to be made on all fronts. He talks about until they're better educated. Well, that's a sad truth, too, that they weren't, because we had failed them as a country to that point as far as educating. And at least in that, he was recognizing that. Now, whether he was right or wrong that they were ready or not ready for positions of political leadership is another thing. And plus, he was also referring, I think, to the radical leaders like Black Panthers. I don't think that he would have thought that about every black person he met. That's why, I recognize what he was saying and what I had heard from many family members. Never really understood that myself. But again, we grew up in a time where that stuff didn't matter to us as kids. At least it didn't to me, and I didn't for you guys. And I did for a lot. So I understand that we are somewhat unique in that respect. Mm-hmm. But, he said those things, he believed them, but they also were representative of the age. Mm-hmm. So I have a hard time condemning him for what he said because everybody else believed it. But I also recognize that, that was not... we still have not yet made progress to where we are now. Granted, where we are now is still not perfect.
Yeah,
you're exactly
obvious
right.
about what's going on in the world.
And I do not want to turn this into a fawning adulation of the man, because he was human just like everybody else was.
Exactly.
Perhaps more so than many. Because of his public stance on certain things, it's easy to vilify him at times. But I do think that makes him far more complex. And I think that's far more interesting when you recognize there's not really any such thing as the marble man. Robert E. Lee was called that once upon a time, and of course there's an irony for you, because he is somebody that now is being completely turned around and being removed all over the place because he was, and I'll use the word vile racist, but he didn't see it that way. And that's the problem with American society at different times. I think that, Robert, that's what you're trying to say is our society is polluted in certain ways at certain times. And it's up to those who are around as they reach their ascendancy to change things. And I do believe that Wayne's generation was a victim, in many ways, of what they were taught and what they believed, and they couldn't get out of that. It took extraordinary men and women like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and even Malcolm X and many others to try and educate them. Some, like Charlton Heston, got it and went with it.
And got it early.
They got it early and changed it and changed their understanding. Others like Wayne couldn't. for whatever reason. And
and that's 8 years before he died. Who knows what? Because honestly,
correct.
I don't know.
That's just one snapshot and one thing. If someone said it was taken out of context, that's usually an excuse.
There's also probably there could be some truth to that. We don't know what because it's a printed article. You don't know what was said leading to that, because I don't have the article in front of me. So, yeah, it's possible. But even if it's possible it was taken out of context, he still said it.
Yeah, that's correct.
And he's known for treating everyone he came in contact with personally well. I mean, he treated people decently and equally. And I think 71 is a really tough time. 71, there's so much violence, so much has happened. The early promise of the civil rights and the changes of the 60s, it's really, really difficult that it came to horrible things, Manson and so much violence, and people reacted to that. I don't think Wayne would have said that in 1965. But in 1971, maybe he got pushed into feeling like there was just too much violence and just we weren't ready.
Well,
I don't know.
It was that could be definitely a time of great upheaval. Huge.
Yeah, I see similar, not similar in content, but parallels in some of the comments being made. Because obviously we're recording this in the middle of riots that are happening across the country over death of the man in Minneapolis. George Floyd, I think was the last name. It was George Floyd, right? Floyd.
Yes, that's correct. George Floyd.
Yeah, I was sure that was it, but I also didn't want to say it if it wasn't, because that would have been just as bad.
Well, and also here in our own city.
Breonna
Taylor killed in a no-knock police raid.
On the wrong house.
In the wrong house. It's heartbreaking. She was an EMT and...
Yeah. But you see people who are, when they see people rioting over this, which I understand the rioting, I don't condone it by far, but I also know that there's more to that rioting that's going on, because there seem to be outside elements in a lot of these places that are making it worse. But those who condemn the rioting, they're kind of missing the point. And to me, it's a similar kind of thing that is being said here that John Wayne was saying. So it just goes to show you that even 40 years later, we are not as far along as we would like to think.
Yeah.
No.
Don't we wish? Yeah, we certainly do wish that. But and not to say that we don't have a lot hasn't changed, but it seems we have a tendency to backslide. All it takes is the wrong thing, the wrong way, at the wrong time, just like these two incidents, and the city's burned.
No, it's more than just these two. I mean, it's...
These are just the obvious examples in the moment.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the three of us can never really, truly understand what it's like to, I read a post on Facebook earlier, and this is really just a great example. I'm talking about a guy, it was a picture of him and his daughter and walking his dog down their neighborhood. He's a black man. He said, I will never walk my neighborhood without my daughter and my dog, or my dog, because by myself I will be seen differently. Now, I would never even think twice about that for myself, because it truly is.
There's an institutional racism we cannot get past. We try, at least in law we were able to do so, but there's a whole,
But sometimes the law isn't all that fair and balanced either.
Well, that's correct. That's right. It tries to be blind. But how do you overcome things like that? Where just by the
I don't know that you ever will.
Well, I have the willingness to work for it.
Yes, you have to work for it.
That's right. Of course, we all do.
It would be immoral not to. But
it's hard
people
not
will
to
always latch onto what is different as being bad and what is the same as being good. That's human nature, unfortunately. It's part of our flawed, fallen nature. And to circle it back around to the Duke, in so many of the roles that he plays, I think he plays heroic characters that try to, and to a large extent, do overcome our human flaws.
Yes.
Because of the time that he made those movies, maybe he's not dealing with racism as one of those flaws, but that it's because those kind of movies just weren't made when he was making movies. But that's the essence of being a hero, is you overcome your own flaws. And you are willing to sacrifice for the greater good.
Yeah, even though he personally maybe not was able to live up to that, he at least on the screen gave us hope that it could be done. And I think that's why
so many of his parts were about defending those who couldn't defend others or defend themselves.
Mm-hmm.
A movie like Rio Bravo or a movie like El Dorado, he came to the side of the underdog and stood up against people who took advantage of their position and tried to stand for law and order and justice. And I think that would be a good example for us right now.
Mm-hmm.
Stand for decency, stand for decency, stand for those who can't defend themselves, take up for others in the mold of the Duke, and understand that wanton violence, wanton destruction really doesn't help. It doesn't. It just puts you back to 1971.
Well, and to be fair on some of that wanton violence and destruction, I don't know if you guys have seen the reports, but and maybe this is off topic, but a lot of that seems to have been instigated by outsiders.
That's
at least Louisville and in Minneapolis and other places.
Yeah.
So that's people pushing an agenda.
Well, it goes back to that wonderful quote by Michael Caine in the movie The Dark Knight. Some people, Mr. Wayne, just want to watch the world burn.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunately what we're dealing with here. And because it's a shame, because those who have legitimate grievances and wish to express their outrage at this, because it is an outrageous thing that deserves to be called for what it is, injustice, a wrong that has been committed, are themselves never having that message understood because of those who cloak it in violence. And now that becomes the narrative. Their very cause that they're trying to bring awareness to is subsumed and diluted and perhaps evaporated. Hijacked is a great word.
Hijacked, I think, is the better, because that really puts blame on the wrongs.
Yeah, genuine, decent people in this town, wanted to protest something that should not have happened, and then it's been hijacked into something indiscriminate that doesn't have anything to do with what needs to happen. No-knock warrants need some kind of a review in this town.
Yeah. How can that ever change?
There's nothing to review in just about anywhere. I mean,
How can that ever change if you can't even have a discussion about it, because the narrative's been changed over to look at what these people are doing. They're burning down their neighborhood and they're killing people, shooting people.
But it might be that without something this drastic, it won't change.
Perhaps, and that's a good argument. Yes.
And it's not to excuse or condone that sort of thing, because I don't. But I also recognize, and this is something that's been brought up a lot, and this is very true. To me, it points to the heart of those that don't understand versus those that do. And that is,
these things still keep happening.
Well, you haven't got to the quote yet. When you are as upset about a target being looted as you are about a man being murdered by having a grown man kneel on his neck for 9 minutes, that's part of the problem. You're equating destruction of property with loss of life. Those are never equal. Never.
That's
because
right.
If they are, you worship a false god.
Well said, sir. You're exactly right.
So, anyways, I'd like to think that John Wayne's characters, especially the most heroic of them, would have been just as incensed and outraged over the injustices that are going, because that's the kind of stuff that his characters, again, not the exact same thing, because those kind of movies weren't being made, but in general, I think almost anybody that's an aficionado of John Wayne, I don't think anybody would have any trouble seeing him on the right side of these events.
I think you're exactly right.
I think you're exactly right. At least the characters he played, that he was famous for, the legend of John Wayne, which we all recognize is always never completely true. He would stand for justice, and that was the time that he made these movies. Justice was a very important theme. It didn't matter the genre, and there's a reason for that, because when you're faced with injustice, there's part of you that cries out for something to make things right, especially in an imperfect world. And it seems like, as I said, this stuff keeps happening over and over. It goes away, though we think, and we all go about our happy lives until something else like this happens, and we wonder, well, wait a minute, I thought we fixed this. No, of course not. We just stopped thinking about it. Maybe there's the great sin. It requires more
We're
of
all
us.
people, and we all suck.
Yes.
That's kind of a P.J. O'Rourke take. It's too bad humans are all human, because they all suck pretty much.
Well, that is, part of the problem. I think it was maybe Chesterton who said that anyone who doubts original sin just needs to read the newspaper. Now we watch cable news.
I was going to say, if he didn't say it, he should have, because it's damning accurate, that's for sure.
Yeah, if it wasn't him, it was somebody around that time.
Yeah.
But that's why somebody like a John Wayne is a great cultural touchstone to me, because of we know not all of us, but the ones we remember him the most for, the ones we like him the best in, are the ones where, like Martin said, he was there for the little guy against those who were taking advantage of those who could not protect themselves.
Yeah.
And I think as Americans, that's part and parcel of what it means to be us, because it's a nature we have adopted, part of our identity. We're not great at it all the time, certainly,
right.
But we always want to be that person as a country that will fight for the little guy, fight for the underdog. It's why we tried to intervene in Somalia. It's why we sent troops as part of the UN peacekeeping forces to Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. It's why we get involved in places where perhaps nobody else is willing to be involved, or places where, heck, it's even part of why we went to Kuwait the first time, and took so many people with us, so many different countries. It wasn't just about oil. Yes, it was partially about that, because that would have been incredibly disruptive to the world economy. But, we saw a tiny little country that could not defend itself that was quite important politically. And so we went and helped. Now, that you can argue that started us down a quagmire that we are yet to fully get out of, but that's an entirely different thing.
Well, as Trevor Slattery would say, complicated.
Yeah.
It's complicated. Yes.
Complicated, yeah. It's all complicated.
That should be our unofficial sub title to this.
That's right. That's correct. Because Trevor appears in just about every episode. Just about every episode drops by.
Because everything's complicated.
That's exactly right. Well, and I think that we always we joke, but really we need to realize that, because one of the great sins, I think, in American society or any society, is we try to oversimplify things that in order to get our arms around it, but we do a disservice to the issue by doing that. We need to try to expand our minds and not try to reduce the facts.
It is the problem of mass media, especially in the days of the internet. It used to be, they talked about a 30-second soundbite. 30 seconds is an eternity now.
Yeah,
it's a 5-second soundbite.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
clickbait.
Dumbing things down, going it to reducing things to the least common denominator is what does a disservice to all of this. Because you can't take a complex issue and explain it in 5 seconds, or even come up with a proposal. Much less that, if you can't explain the problem in 5 seconds, you sure as hell can't come up with a solution in 5.
Yeah.
Amen.
Francis, brother, I think we've covered the Duke.
I think
And then
so.
some.
And then some. Yeah, we.
So what's up for next week, Brad?
Well, in many respects, it's going to be kind of a continuation of this because it's very similar. We're doing pop culture next time, but we're going to talk about the Western as a general rule, and the Western as an art form. We've talked about John Wayne's contributions to it, but he was himself his own thing. We're going to broaden our discussion in many ways, talk about this is something that's uniquely American. It's an amazing piece that we've given to the world, and we're going to go a little bit deep with exactly why is it cool? What is it about that is worth talking about? So please join us.
Thanks for being with us here every week at Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Be sure to spread the word on your social media accounts. Follow us and retweet us. We are on Instagram and on Twitter at Snakes and Otters.
Let your friends know that they can find us on Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. Just search Snakes and Otters Podcast to find us, and please remember to leave us your comments and reviews. It helps people find us.
And you can always send us an email at snakesandotterspodcast@gmail.com.
I'm Martin.
I'm Robert.
And I'm Francis. Catch us next week. Same snake time, same otter channel.